March 12, 1945. Northern Luzon, Philippines. The jungle smelled like rot and gunpowder. Flies circled lazily over shell casings that littered the mud like bronze confetti. And through the haze of smoke and heat, a barefoot woman walked toward a line of American rifles with her hands raised high and her eyes locked forward. If you're watching from somewhere in the world where stories like this still matter, hit that like button. Drop a comment telling us your country. Subscribe if you believe history lives in the spaces between the headlines, because what happened next in that clearing defied every rule of war both sides had written. The soldier who saw her first was from Amarillo, Texas, dust and cattle country. He'd been sitting on an ammunition crate, hat tilted low, cigarette smoke curling past his lips. When she emerged from the tree line, he didn't shout, he didn't flinch. He just stood, slow and deliberate, one hand resting near his belt. His name wasn't recorded in any official report, but what she said to him would echo for the rest of his life. "I'll be your wife." The words fell into the clearing like a stone into still water. The other soldiers froze. One laughed nervously, then stopped when he saw the cowboy's face. She didn't smile, didn't plead. She just stood there, filthy and bleeding, speaking broken English with the conviction of someone who had already made peace with the unthinkable. And in that moment, both of them realized something terrifying. The war had taught them to hate, but it hadn't taught them what to do when hatred failed. The Empire of Shadows. She had been trained to die before surrender. That was the code, unspoken but absolute. Bushido, loyalty unto death. The Imperial Japanese Army's medical corps drilled it into every nurse from the first day of training. You do not retreat, you do not waver. If the enemy approaches, you use whatever is at hand. A scalpel, a grenade, your own hands if necessary. The barracks outside Manila had been suffocating. Rows of cots, thin as paper, rice rations that shrank every week. Wounded soldiers arrived with limbs missing, minds shattered, eyes that stared past you into some void only they could see. She learned to stitch flesh by candlelight, to inject morphine without asking questions, to recognize the difference between a scream of pain and a scream of something worse. The officers spoke in absolutes. America will violate you. They will humiliate you. Death is honor. Capture is eternal shame. She believed them. Why wouldn't she? The world she knew had no room for doubt. Her two brothers had died at Saipan, their names read aloud at a ceremony where her mother did not cry. Grief was indulgence. Survival without honor was rot. But when the orders came to retreat deeper into the jungle, something inside her fractured. Another nurse had hanged herself the night before. A third had slit her own throat with medical scissors, her body discovered at dawn with eyes still open. The shame was supposed to be unbearable, but all she felt was tired. So she walked away from the camp, away from the code, into 3 days of jungle, where she drank from streams that tasted like ash and hid behind the rusted hulks of burned-out tanks. She didn't plan to surrender. She just didn't plan to die. By the time she stumbled into that clearing, barefoot and hollow-eyed, she had already committed the greatest sin her world recognized. She had chosen to keep breathing, the cowboy who listened. He hadn't wanted to be there either. The draft letter arrived on a Tuesday, folded into his back pocket while he finished feeding the horses. Amarillo, Texas. Wide skies and wind that never stopped. His mother had died when he was 12. His father ran the ranch with leather hands and a Bible he referenced more than he read. Boot camp was noise, too much of it, shouting, marching, boys pretending to be men. He hated the crowds, the forced camaraderie, the way everything felt like performance. But he didn't break. He just pulled inward the way he always had and waited for it to be over. The Pacific shattered that patience. Okinawa, New Guinea, Luzon, heat that soaked into your bones, rain that turned foxholes into graves. He watched boys younger than him die from dysentery, from shrapnel, from infections that turned their skin black. He held a dying man's hand for an hour because there was no one else who could. He didn't hate the Japanese, he didn't understand them, but the war taught him to stop expecting meaning. Orders were orders. Death came fast or it came slow. What mattered was who you were when it didn't come at all. By March 1945, he was exhausted in a way sleep couldn't touch. Not angry, not bitter, just tired. So when the nurse stepped into the clearing and said what she said, he didn't laugh. He didn't mock. He just looked at her, saw something he recognized, and nodded once. "You hungry?" It wasn't a question, it was an anchor. The unraveling, they gave her water first, then a towel. Someone handed her a tin cup of soup, and she stared at it like it might vanish. The camp smelled like stew and sweat, and something she couldn't name. Normalcy, there were guard towers. Yes, barbed wire. Yes, but no one shoved her. No one spat. She was assigned a cot in the women's section. The blanket was soft. The pillow smelled like starch. A tin plate sat at the foot of the bed with bread on it. Real bread. She bit into it slowly, tasting salt and flour in disbelief. That night, she didn't sleep. She sat on the edge of the cot with her knees tucked up, listening to the camp breathe around her. Somewhere nearby, someone was playing a harmonica. The notes floated through the night like smoke, soft and almost playful, as if beauty hadn't been outlawed. The next morning, he was there again, in the mess tent. He didn't wear his hat inside, but she recognized him anyway. That same quiet around him, that same look of someone watching without judgment. He nodded once, set a cup of coffee beside her tray, and walked away. No words, no strings, just kindness, delivered like it cost him nothing. It undid her more than cruelty ever could. The language of small things camp rules were strict. No fraternizing between guards and prisoners. Contact was supervised, limited, regulated, like water from a canteen. But rules were made for a world that didn't account for what silence could carry. It began with a book. He dropped it near her in the laundry tent without stopping. A small English-Japanese dictionary, half missing its cover, pages dog-eared and worn. Inside the front flap, he'd scribbled one sentence in pencil. Start with John, page 100. She didn't know what John meant, but she found the page and read slowly, finger trembling. In the beginning was the word. She whispered the English sounds over and over, shaping her mouth around them like seeds. She didn't believe in the God behind those verses, but she believed in the sound of them, the rhythm, the strange, fragile beauty of being taught by someone who never asked for anything in return. They saw each other in stolen minutes. A hallway near the infirmary. The edge of the vegetable garden, where she worked once her leg healed. Sometimes he passed by and handed her a note folded in wax paper. What did your sky look like before the war? One read. She didn't always answer with words. Sometimes she drew mountains, a small house, 2 boys fishing. He understood. She told him haltingly about her brothers. He told her about a dog he'd had in Texas, a horse he'd named after his mother. These were not declarations. They were confessions made to air, not expecting an echo, but echoes came anyway. The weight of watching eyes, it didn't take long for others to notice. Camps thrived on rumor. Whispers traveled faster than orders. Some of the Japanese nurses began turning their backs when she entered a room. One hissed the word Yurageramono under her breath. She had survived the same hunger, the same indoctrination. But she had crossed an invisible line. She spoke to an American. Worse, she spoke to that one. Shame returned, not imposed by officers, but by peers who needed her to be wrong so they could remain right. He felt it too. A sergeant pulled him aside near the supply tent, voice low. Careful, you're getting noticed. This ain't personal, it's protocol. He nodded, said yes sir, the way he always did, but inside something hardened. He'd followed orders that sent boys to die. This one, this quiet cruelty of enforced indifference, felt worse. So they adjusted. They didn't stop, they just became careful. The bar of soap came during a ration change. He noticed her watching the supply pile, eyes lingering a second too long. He waited until no one was looking, slipped 1 bar into his pocket, then passed it to her later in the narrow hallway behind the infirmary. Their fingers brushed, just once. She stared at the soap like it might burn her hands. It smelled faintly of lavender. Too clean, too gentle for war. She hid it under her shirt and didn't breathe again until she was alone. That bar of soap became everything they could not say. Proof that someone saw her not as an enemy, but as a person worthy of care. The end of the world. The news came not with shouts, but with silence. Early August, the sun hadn't yet climbed over the camp fences when a ripple moved through the prisoners. First a whisper, then stillness. Japan had surrendered. She was in the garden when she heard a fellow nurse said it flatly while pulling weeds. They've surrendered. She didn't cry in front of anyone, but later, curled on her cot, she wept like a child. Not for the emperor, for something deeper. The certainty that had once shaped her life had vanished. All the rules, the oaths, the deaths they had led here, to surrender, to nothing. He knew his time in the camp was over. Orders flew, soldiers were reassigned. He'd be moved to Manila, then maybe home. Home, the word felt distant, like a place he'd only imagined. That night, beneath a sky swollen with stars, they saw each other again near the edge of the camp where the fence sagged and the world felt wider. She wore a shawl over her shoulders. He held a small flashlight. No one spoke for a while. Finally, his voice came low and rough. "They're sending you home," she nodded. Soon she looked at him, eyes glassy but steady. "You remember what I said in the jungle?" He nodded. "I'll be your wife," she said again, softer this time, "but not as a bargain. I mean, if I had known you before the war, I would have followed you home." There were no answers, no promises. The war had stripped too much away. They stood there, not touching, silence thick between them. Then she reached into her coat and handed him a letter. "For your mother," he took it, but it was weeks before he opened it. He is kind, he listens. He made me believe the world is not only war. Please tell him not to forget that he was my peace. The long silence she returned to a Japan she didn't recognize. Yokohama in ruins, streets turned to dust, homes reduced to skeletons. The people moved like shadows, not defeated, just emptied. She stepped off the boat with a single suitcase and a head full of silence. No one asked what she'd seen. No one wanted to know. The house she returned to was not the one she'd left. Her parents were gone. Her youngest brother's room had been repurposed by neighbors. She lived in a small apartment near the port, working in a clinic that stitched wounds but never asked their origins. Every night before she lay down, she unfolded a blanket plain olive drab from the camp and wrapped herself in it like armor. It smelled faintly of soap and smoke, of something once known, now too far to touch. In Texas, the land hadn't changed. The wind still moved through the grass with that low whisper. The cattle still kicked up dust. But to him, everything felt smaller. After the jungle, after the war, after her, everything felt like an echo. He rebuilt the fences, rode the same trails, but his silence was no longer stoic. It was the silence of a man who had once touched another world and come back unable to explain it. He never spoke her name, but in the top drawer of his nightstand, wrapped in torn flannel, he kept a small bar of soap, dried, cracked, still holding the faintest trace of lavender. She, too, remained unmarried. Suitors came and went. She never let them stay long. Instead, she poured herself into her work. The clinic grew. She trained other nurses. They called her strong. They called her kind. They never called her lonely. But each year, on the same date, she would take out a letter, faded, worn at the edges, written in a man's hand. Simple, direct. "There's someone here who reminds me why I don't want to be hard anymore." She read it slowly, lips forming each word as if they still held breath. The echo that remained. The year was 1987. The war had been over longer than he'd been alive before it began. He found the clipping by accident, folded into the local paper halfway through a Sunday edition. A short international column. Book review, Japan. Memoir of a war nurse released overseas. He would have turned the page if not for a single line. A Japanese woman writes of an American cowboy who once gave her soap in a prison camp. His hands went numb. The kitchen clock kept ticking. The world did not stop, but he did. The article said the nurse had survived, that she'd written about captivity, about dignity, about small mercies that changed her understanding of the enemy. It didn't give her name in English. It didn't mention the jungle or the goodbye, but it mentioned the soap. That night, he sat at the kitchen table with a blank sheet of paper, his hand shaking. What could he say? That he remembered her, that he had kept the soap, that he had carried her with him through seasons and storms. He wrote simply that he was glad she lived, that he hoped she'd found peace, that there was a ranch in Texas where the wind still sounded the same. "I never forgot you." He folded the letter, walked to the mailbox at the end of the drive, and placed it inside. Whether it reached her, no one knows. There was no reply. He stopped checking. But sometimes, late at night, she would wake and sit up in bed, the old blanket folded at her feet. A thought would pass through her, not regret, not longing, something gentler, like knowing a voice without hearing it. She died on a spring morning. The children planted flowers in her memory. In her will, she left behind only books and a note. "Please give the blanket to someone who feels cold, even when the room is warm." He passed away 2 years later. Heart failure, quiet, alone. In his top drawer, a letter addressed to no one. I saw the world fall apart, and in the rubble, I saw someone who chose to stand. I hope she forgave me for letting her go. Their names are not etched into any monument. But somewhere, a teacher gently wraps a student in a blanket. Somewhere else, a boy learns to hold the reins lightly, like something alive. And in these small gestures, they live not as ghosts, but as echoes. Dignity is not loud, but it endures.